Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 7 and 8 of the book, and these chapters are somewhat shorter than the ones we've covered up to this point, especially chapter 8, so who knows, we might get out of class early. It's a beautiful day. We can just go out and enjoy ourselves. But first, we have to cover these two chapters of the book. So let's get started with chapter 7, principle number 7, resist conspiracy theories. Now, if you've been with me up to this point, you know that Wallace likes to begin the chapters with an opening anecdote relating a story from his experience as a cold case detective. And this chapter's opening anecdote is about Charlie and Vic, who are roommates who were arrested and accused of a robbery that escalated into a homicide. They tried to rob a guy and things went bad, and one of them wound up killing the guy, stabbing him fatally. And there is a security video record of the crime, but the video isn't clear enough to be able to identify either of the attackers, but some other evidence led the detectives to arrest Charlie and Vic, and now they've got them separated in interrogation rooms, and Wallace is taking turns talking first to Charlie and then to Vic. And Wallace manipulates Charlie and Vic into each believing that the other has ratted him out, until eventually Vic offers a statement to the police that is consistent with the video evidence, so they know he's not just making it up, and that establishes Charlie as the one who actually dealt the fatal blow to the victim. By tricking Vic into thinking that Charlie had turned on him first, Wallace was able to convince Vic to return the favor and rat out Charlie and actually give them a version of the story that coincided with the facts that they did know. So, quote, "In my experience as a detective, I've investigated many conspiracies and multiple suspect crimes. While successful conspiracies are the popular subject of many movies and novels, I've come to learn that they are, in reality, very difficult to pull off." And Wallace then lists the common characteristics of successful conspiracies, characteristics such as a small number of conspirators, thorough and immediate communication between conspirators, a short time span over which the conspiracy has to be maintained, strong relations between conspirators, and little to no pressure on the conspirators to turn on one another and reveal the conspiracy to others. Well, Charlie and Vic found it difficult to maintain their conspiracy because even though they had a small number of conspirators, just the two of them, they were separated after their arrests and unable to communicate. They were roommates, but they weren't very close friends other than sharing a living space together. And because they were facing the prospect of prison, they had a great deal of pressure to cooperate with the police and turn on one another and break up the conspiracy. Well, I get the point that Wallace is making, but Charlie and Vic's story doesn't strike me as the ideal example to bring out when the subject is conspiracies. They were partners in crime who fucked up and then couldn't keep their story straight and wound up turning on each other after they got arrested. It does qualify as a conspiracy according to the legal definition, which Wallace provides us in a sidebar in this chapter, but it doesn't match the alleged conspiracy that Wallace is going to spend the balance of this chapter discussing, and I bet you can guess what conspiracy that is. Yes, our subject is from Wallace's perspective, the alleged conspiracy created by the 12 apostles to propagate the myth of the resurrection of Christ. This is an argument that apologists often bring up as though it is a common skeptical argument against Christianity. I don't hear this argument from skeptics very often. I don't know very many non-Christians, non-believers who say that they don't believe the Gospels because they believe that there was a conspiracy theory, there was a conspiracy created and carried out by the 12 apostles. Most of us don't believe that, but it is something that is brought up over and over and over again by apologists such as Wallace as essentially a straw man argument. So let's watch Wallace beat the crap out of this straw man, shall we? Wallace describes his thoughts on the subject from his days as a non-believer. Quote, "In an effort to promote their cause and strengthen their own position within their religious community, I believed these 12 men concocted, executed, and maintained the most elaborate and influential conspiracy of all time. But as I learned more about the nature of conspiracies and had the opportunity to investigate and break several conspiracy cases, I started to doubt the reasonable nature of the alleged Christian conspiracy. Now, maybe that is his current Christianity sort of projecting onto his past atheism, but isn't it interesting that even as a non-Christian back in the day, Wallace had an apologist's desire to exaggerate the importance of the pivotal figures in early Christianity. It wasn't just that the apostles carried out a conspiracy, it was the most elaborate and influential conspiracy of all time. It's something that we see apologists do quite often, that has recurred over and over again as I've gone through the various books I've examined in these series. The key events and key figures of early Christianity are the most important people who ever lived. And the questions that we ask ourselves to determine whether or not Christianity is true are the most important questions we will ever ask. There's a lot of exaggeration about the importance of Christianity and the people involved in it. And so apparently, if we were to believe his account, even as an atheist, Wallace felt that way about Christianity. Wallace goes into all of the challenges that such a conspiracy would have faced, including the number of conspirators, which would have been 12 at a minimum, although Wallace also suggests that there possibly could have been hundreds, an inability to communicate once they were scattered following the death of Jesus, a lack of closeness among the disciples. Many of them had been strangers to one another prior to becoming followers of Jesus, the persecution that they faced, and the length of time that they had to maintain the conspiracy. Wallace notes that, for instance, the Apostle John is said to have lived another 60 years after the death of Jesus without ever apparently giving up the conspiracy. Quote, "Following their dispersion from Jerusalem, the 12 disciples were scattered across the Roman Empire and, according to the most ancient accounts, were ultimately interrogated and martyred far from one another. While skeptics sometimes claim that these recorded locations of martyrdom are unreliable because they're part of a biased Christian account, there isn't a single non-Christian record that contradicts the claims of martyrdom offered by the local communities and historians." And Wallace goes on to mention that none of the witnesses to the resurrected Christ referred to in the Bible, and he mentions 120 who saw Christ in the upper room, and then 500 at another time who were witnesses to the resurrected Christ according to Paul. None of these people ever recanted their testimony, Wallace says. But of course, these witnesses left us no testimony that could have been recanted. We don't have testimony from 120 people in the upper room. We have one reference from the book of Acts to there being 120 people in the upper room at some point. And the episode from which that 120 people figure is taken is from an event where Jesus wasn't even there. It's just used to establish that you could fit 120 people in that room. And Wallace says there could have been 120 people there when Jesus appeared to the disciples in the upper room. Nor do we have testimony from 500 witnesses who saw Jesus after his resurrection. We have one reference in 1 Corinthians to Jesus appearing to 500 people at once, sometime, somewhere. Wallace treats this as evidence of something, but imagine if I told you that I saw Elvis alive at the Sheets on Sharpsburg Pike a few months ago, and there were 25 other people there, and they saw Elvis too, and not one of those people has come forward yet to deny that Elvis was there. Does that make my Elvis story any more credible? Does that mean I have 25 eyewitnesses to Elvis being alive? The references to hundreds of witnesses to the risen Christ in the New Testament are worth even less than the witnesses in my Elvis story, because at least I've given you enough detail that someone, maybe with access to the proper resources, might be able to track down a few people who were present at Sheets on Sharpsburg Pike around that time to see if anyone else around there saw Elvis, or at least heard about there being an Elvis sighting there around that time. The 1 Corinthians reference is literally just Paul saying Jesus appeared to 500 of the brethren at once. No names, no date, no location, no way to verify anything that he said. And to the vagueness of the reference, we must add the outlandishness of the claim itself. If I said that I saw the mayor of Hagerstown at Sheets on Sharpsburg Pike a few weeks ago, no big deal. Even if I have no evidence to establish this fact, most people who hear the claim will see little reason to doubt it. The mayor of Hagerstown was at Sheets. Okay? Sure, I might be making it up, but there's nothing about the claim itself that is so unusual as to demand extraordinary evidence before you accept it. But I'm saying I saw Elvis, a famous person who is known to be dead, at Sheets a couple of weeks ago. That's an extraordinary claim. It's not just unusual, it's something that should be impossible. According to the commonly accepted scientific understanding of how the world operates, it is impossible. Dead people don't turn up at convenience stores to buy pizza subs and sweet potato fries. It's not a rare occurrence, it's a non-occurrence. I can't just claim that it happened and that lots of other people saw it and expect to be believed. That doesn't make me sound like a credible eyewitness. It makes me sound like a bad liar. Now, before leaving this subject, let me talk about the martyrdom of the disciples. As Wallace acknowledges in that passage I quoted, many skeptics, myself included, aren't very impressed by the martyrdom of the disciples because we don't have good sources. Just as he touts the lack of recanted testimony from witnesses of Jesus' resurrection appearances while conveniently omitting the lack of actual testimony, Wallace also asserts that the traditional Christian accounts of the deaths of the disciples are not contradicted by non-Christian sources, while glossing over the fact that we also lack corroborating non-Christian sources. We don't have verification or refutation. All we have are church traditions. And why does that matter? After all, the claims about the deaths of the disciples aren't nearly as extraordinary as those about the resurrection of Jesus. So the disciples were persecuted for their beliefs and imprisoned and eventually executed. Nothing about that should arouse our skepticism, right? Nothing about that violates our understanding of the universe, the laws of nature. Well, maybe we should be skeptical about it after all. Let's turn back to my Elvis story. I said there were 25 eyewitnesses who also saw Elvis at Sheets that day, and not one of them has ever come forward to say that Elvis wasn't actually there. What I didn't tell you was that eventually all 25 of those people were arrested and sent to prison. Even then, not one of them ever disputed that Elvis had been at Sheets that day. Now, the bit about the people being arrested and sent to prison is much more believable, much more compatible with our understanding of reality than the claim that Elvis was alive. But that comparatively mundane claim is made more suspect by the fact that I'm using it to establish the most extraordinary claim in my story. I'm not just saying 25 people who were at Sheets on a particular day were eventually arrested and sent to prison. I'm saying 25 people who were at Sheets on a particular day were arrested and sent to prison and never denied that Elvis was alive. The claim isn't suspect because it's extraordinary in and of itself. It's suspect because I'm obviously including it in my story because I want you to believe that Elvis was alive and present at Sheets on that day. And that's why it's significant that we have only Christian sources for the circumstances of the deaths of the disciples. Apologists such as Wallace cite the deaths of the disciples and their lack of recanting their testimony about Jesus as some of the most compelling evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. They ask, why would they die for a lie? How else do we explain that the disciples went to their deaths without ever recanting their testimony about Jesus, but to assume they were telling the truth, or at least firmly believed they were? Our only source of information about the circumstances of the deaths of the disciples is the Christian church. The only source of information we have to establish that the disciples were executed without ever denying Christ or renouncing their Christianity is a group of people that believed and very much wanted others to believe that Jesus was the Son of God who had risen from the dead after the crucifixion. Many of us are skeptical of the martyrdom of the disciples for this reason, just as I imagine a detective with the experience of Wallace would be skeptical if, say, the parent of a murder suspect came forward to provide them with an alibi. In this case, it's not the nature of the claim itself that raises suspicion, but the motives of those who are making the claim, and the fact that the claim cannot be substantiated by independent evidence. The tool to add to our detective kit from this chapter is, of course, a healthy skepticism about conspiracy theories. And this is a great tool to have. Regardless of the subject being investigated, we should always be extremely skeptical of conspiracy theories. Unfortunately for Wallace, one need not entertain any conspiracy theories in order to reject the central claims of Christianity. Wallace finds it unlikely that the disciples invented and maintained a conspiracy to convince others that Jesus returned from his death, yet he seems to accept with total conviction that Jesus did actually return from his death, that the stories attributed to the disciples about the death and supernatural return of Jesus are true. I find it much more likely that those stories themselves, along with the details of the deaths of the disciples, were invented later by people who wanted others to believe that Jesus had been resurrected and that his devoted followers had chosen to die rather than renounce him. The argument over whether or not the disciples participated in a conspiracy to promote the myth of Jesus' resurrection falls flat for the same reason as the argument over how to account for Jesus' empty tomb. I see no evidence compelling me to even have the argument in the first place. Before demanding that I account for the empty tomb, establish that there was an empty tomb. Before demanding that I account for the testimony of the disciples, show me some testimony. If Wallace can't do that, and apparently he can't, then all his skepticism about conspiracy theories is good for is creating a distraction. Well, that's it for Chapter 7. Let's move on to Chapter 8, which is principle number 8. Respect the chain of custody. Get used to seeing those quotes. Anyway, opening anecdote. Wallace recounts a trial that resulted from one of his cold case investigations where a crucial piece of evidence for the prosecution, a button found at the crime scene that was later linked to a shirt belonging to the defendant, was called into question by the defense because there was no clear photograph to establish that the button had in fact been discovered at the crime scene. The defense suggested that the button had in fact not been originally found at the crime scene, but had been introduced into evidence by police after a search warrant had been executed at the home of the defendant. Luckily, the jury didn't accept this evidence tampering theory, and the defendant was convicted of the crime. Wallace explains the importance of the chain of custody. Quote, detectives quickly learned the importance of documenting and tracking key pieces of evidence. If the evidence isn't carefully handled, a number of questions will plague the case as it is presented to a jury. Was a particular piece of evidence truly discovered at the scene? How do we know it was actually there? How do we know that an officer didn't plant it there? Why is plant in scare quotes there? As though police planting evidence is some mythical occurrence. I'm not cynical enough to believe that cops plant evidence on a regular basis, but it has been known to happen from time to time, has it not? Typically, when writers use scare quotes in that way, it indicates that they reject the validity of the concept within the quotes, like when misogynists on the internet sneer at women having to deal with sexism, or something like that. Misplaced policeman's pride on Wallace's part, perhaps. Anyway, here's what all this has to do with Christianity. Quote, those who are skeptical of the New Testament Gospels offer a similar objection based on the chain of custody. The Gospels claim to be eyewitness accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. These accounts were eventually entered into the court record when they were established as scripture at the Council of Laodicea and in AD 363. It was here that early Christian leaders first identified and codified the canon of the Christian scripture, the official list of 27 books and letters that became the New Testament. If the life of Jesus could be considered the Christian crime scene, this council was undoubtedly the courtroom where the evidence of the eyewitness testimony was first formally acknowledged. So the best way to counter this chain of custody objection to the New Testament documents, Wallace says, is to examine who handled the evidence from the time of the crime, which would be the life of Jesus, to the point when it was entered into the court record, which would be the time of the Council of Laodicea. In a criminal investigation, the links in this chain would include the officers who first responded to the scene, the first crime scene investigators who identified and collected evidence, and then, of course, the detectives who investigated the crime. In the case of Christianity, the chain would include the original eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus and their disciples, and then the disciples of those disciples, and so on until we get from the life of Jesus, which he places at circa AD 33, to the Council of Laodicea, which is AD 363. And unfortunately, we'll have to wait until a bit later in the book to follow that chain of evidence more closely, because that's pretty much it for this chapter. Wallace merely introduces the subject and then promises to explore it in depth in section 2. Okay then. I guess he needed an extra chapter in the book. I don't know. Feels a bit like padding to introduce a concept and then decline to discuss it further, only to promise to bring it up again later in the same book. The detective tip is, of course, to discover and respect the chain of evidence. Wallace contrasts the chain of evidence of other ancient documents, and he uses as the example the writings of Herodotus, with the chain of evidence that we have for the New Testament documents. He says, quote, "We don't know how Herodotus' record was preserved or what happened to it during the first 500 years after the documents originated. This is, of course, the nature of the vast majority of ancient historical accounts. Given that we accept these accounts as historically factual, even though their history of transmission is missing for 5 centuries or more, wouldn't it be fair to reconsider our historical view of the gospel record if we discovered that the gospels have a verifiable chain of custody?" Well, first of all, Wallace is suggesting, again, as apologists often do, that other historical documents, like for instance the writings of Herodotus, are examined uncritically by historians, as though they are just accepted as 100% true and reliable. And that is just not the case. Historical documents are routinely subjected to the kind of harsh, critical historical analysis to determine what is reliable information within them and what ought to be doubted or what needs further corroboration, which is exactly the sort of investigation and examination that Wallace pretends that he wants to give to the New Testament, but in fact wants no part of. He doesn't want a real, honest, objective, critical examination of the New Testament documents, because that kind of examination leaves most people with the conclusion that they are not the inspired Word of God, and that the things that they say happened regarding Jesus and his miracles and his resurrection, etc., are probably not to be considered reliable information. But it would be fair to reconsider our notions of how close to the original writings our current copies are, if we had such a chain of evidence, and our notions of who wrote those original documents and when they wrote them. Certainly these are things that we could reconsider if we have a very strong chain of evidence from the origin of the Jesus stories to the time when they were codified at the Council of Laodicea. But we would still be left with the problem of how to harmonize accounts that include miracles, appearances by angels, resurrections, and inaccurate history with the Christian belief that these accounts are essentially true and reliable, and beyond that, the inspired Word of God. Now, I don't want to downplay the murky early history of the New Testament documents or the incomplete provenance that we have of how we got from wherever these documents originated to the versions that we have today. I'm sure that in the minds of many skeptics and non-Christians, that is a very important point that contributed heavily to their rejection of Christianity or their conclusion that it's probably not true. But for me, it wasn't that important. It's not nothing. It is of interest to me and it is of importance to me, but personally, I think that even if I were 100% convinced that the New Testament documents were written by people who were claiming to be eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus, who were alive at the time and could have been eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus, I still wouldn't believe it due to the extraordinary nature of the claims and the lack of substantiating evidence for those claims, which is key lest I be accused of falling prey to the naturalistic fallacy. I'm not saying that I reject the extraordinary nature of the claims because I'm rejecting them on principle and saying philosophically I'm ruling them out and they couldn't ever happen. I'm saying all evidence I have ever seen tells me that they don't happen, and in order for me to believe that they do happen and that they did happen in these instances as detailed in the New Testament, I would need to see evidence of it other than just a record of people saying so. The chain of evidence behind the Book of Mormon, I remind you, is substantially more complete than the chain of evidence we have for the books of the New Testament. I still don't believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and I suspect neither does J. Warner Wallace. Well, that's it for this video. As I said, it'll be a short class this week, everybody, so thank you for joining me. Come back next time for the next 2 chapters of the book, which will be Chapter 9, Principle 9, Know When Enough is Enough. There are those quotes again. Why does he quote things? And Chapter 10, Principle number 10, Prepare for an Attack. Shouldn't that be Prepare for an Attack? I don't know. Anyway, that's it for this video, everybody. Thank you for watching. As always, please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong, whether you are a fellow atheist or a Christian or someone who identifies as something completely different than either of those two. I look forward to hearing your response. If you did enjoy this video, please like it and share it and subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already. Also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron as little as $1 a month. Helps me tremendously to continue to make these videos and other videos like it, all the videos I make on my channel. If my work is something that you enjoy and means something to you and you can afford it and you think I'm worth it, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. The next Patreon milestone has a direct relation to this series because when I reach my next Patreon milestone, I will begin producing high-quality, original, all-new audio podcast recordings of the An Atheist Read series that you can listen to on the go. It's one of the most requested projects I've ever had since I started doing YouTube, so you can help me reach that goal if you are not a Patreon patron at this point by becoming one. I ask that you consider it. I also want to thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.